Hello and welcome to Metal Mixing Tips episode 6, where I'm going to be talking through my use of maximizers when mixing metal. Now, maximizers I prefer to think of as a tool that we have to use out of necessity, really. They do as much harm as they do good for some or most music that we record at home. Unfortunately, the loudness wars have made them an almost essential tool that we have to turn to. I just want to talk very quickly about loudness, and if you aren't really interested in hearing about that, please do skip forward as usual using the skip intro button on the side there. I wanted to show you a website first of all. This guy, Ian Shepherd, productionadvice.co.uk. He has a whole section on the different types of measuring loudness. RMS was a standard that we would normally talk about up until a year or two ago, and then they went and changed it all and made it nicely complicated. So please have a read of that. I'm not going to go into detail. I have always used RMS for the last 10-15 years or so, and that's what I stick with now. One day they may get rid of that, but really stick to or find your preferred format and stick to it, and then you'll have a reference frame to know how loud your stuff is and how it compares to commercial recordings. Personally, I like to use maximizers sparingly. I use them also in combination because I find like stacking compressors, maximizers work far more effectively and cleanly when they're not pushed very far, and when you can compound the effects of a few together, it tends to give you a better result than just pushing one hard. I'm going to cover in this tutorial using them both on individual tracks quickly and then on the mastering bus, and there's a couple of free ones for you as well that I can recommend to show you if you don't have access to any commercial ones. In terms of loudness, what I aim for when I do a mix before I start doing my sort of home mastering to it, I tend to get about -13, -12 RMS out of it, and then once I've finished, I used to look at commercial recordings and they used to be around the -9, -8 maybe at most, and even then they were pushing the limit to what started to sound a bit squished. Nowadays they're even going down as low as 6 or 5 RMS. It's getting ridiculous. And I don't think there's any way in a home studio you're going to get that result without it sounding really bad. So personally, I aim for -9, -10 I'm happy with. From the -13 that my mix starts at to the -10 or -9, I'm only adding 3 or 4 dB. And I'll show you how I do that, and hopefully in the cleanest way possible, and you can try some of these combinations yourself to get the same results. Rule number 1 is maximizers are bad. Rule number 2 is rule number 1 is incorrect if you can find a good use for them. It's the same way with everything in music production. And one good use for them on individual tracks is with drums. I'd recommend against using maximizers on other instrument tracks because they do add a lot of artifacts. Drums are one type of instrument, I think, because they tend to be split between just low frequency and high frequency sounds. It's quite easy for maximizers to deal with. And there's a free one I use, which I've mentioned in my beginner's guide drum tutorials, called the Endorphin. This is a wonderful one you can download free, and it's by Digital Fish Phones, by the way. You see their website at the bottom here. This calls itself a dual band stereo mid-side compressor. It doesn't say it anywhere here, but it is a limiter and effectively a maximizer. Everything you put through this, it puts a -0.1 dB ceiling on it, so you'll never clip. So it can be easy to overdo it without realizing, so you do need to use your ears, but it's one of the best plugins I've seen for drums. Now, I did go through this a bit on the beginner's guide. I'll go through it quickly now, just to show you this side over here, the top input trim and output drive. This effectively works just as a straight up maximizer, and it's very clean, so let's have a listen. It's up to full, and then with the input as well. Starting to distort, pull it back a bit. For metal drums, you see that adds a lot of power, and it's a really clean boost to the signal there. It works really well. I wouldn't normally go that far with it, obviously. Down in this bottom right side, where you've got the mix low, mix high. This is like for the EQ for the lows and the highs, and the low end tends to affect the low end of the snare, the kick drum and the toms, and the high end tends to affect the high end of the snare and the cymbals. It's a really nice split the way they've done it. And then you also have compression options here, compression low, compression high in the same way. I'll play this again and give you an idea of how this affects the sound. Okay, that's all I'm going to show you on this one, because I cover it in a bit more detail in the beginner's guide, and it is really good. I highly recommend you get this for free. As I say, maybe not to use on anything else other than drums. It works really well for that. There are a couple of other free ones you can use for drums. There is Gclip, which I think I may have shown before in a vocal one, if I remember correctly. This is another really good. It's not really a maximizer as such, it's more of a limiter and clipper which does a similar sort of thing. What's great about this one is that it has this visual representation here which allows you to see where your little peaks are, and it's great for just cutting off those extra peaks that poke out a bit higher than you want. So give you an example of this. That's currently quite low. Now we've got some peaks that might be clipping. Cut them off a bit. So there's a really good representation there to show you exactly what effect you're having on the music, and we can see we're just chopping off peaks there, which is a really good visual guide if you don't particularly trust your ears with something. And you, as you may have heard there, it's very clean. It didn't change the sound of the drums too much. Moving on to commercial ones you'll probably be aware of, and which I do use a lot. We've got the L1 limiter. Now, the reason I've shown this, and I'll also be coming on to the L2 limiter for, or they're also maximizers effectively, for drums, is if you want to use parallel compression. Now, the L1 limiter I've actually shown because it's one I suggest you don't use for this, because the L2 is better, and I believe you get them in a bundle anyway. What the L1 is great for is limiting on your master bus, just bringing the out ceiling down to -0.1. It's a very clean limiter. I find it's a bit cleaner than the L2 for just letting things past and brick wall 0.1. So useful for that, not so useful for the parallel compression. The L2 is very good instead of a compressor for using parallel compression and squishing your drums down. The main thing it's good for is on the release, the ARC, the automatic release that Waves have developed. This is really good at helping the maximizer pump properly. Now, you'll notice as I go through this tutorial, I'm not really going to mess with the release on any of the maximizers that I use, because what I find is if you're pumping this enough to hear the release, then you're pumping it too far and you're getting other problems happening anyway. So my opinion is you don't, by the time you're hearing the release, you've gone too far. So I tend not to mess around with that. But when you're doing parallel compression and you really want to pump the drum sound, the ARC tends to find the beat really well and pump with the music. So we'll give this a listen and see what happens. That's turned off for now. A load of compression. That pumping, really dirty sound, but as soon as we you probably heard how with the ARC engaged it sounded a lot cleaner and the pumping was in time with the drums. It's brilliant. You turn it off and you suddenly get this dirty sound to the kick, and you can hear the release is out of time with the beat. So L2 is a really good alternative for parallel compression, something worth trying. Moving on to the master bus now and how you would mix with maximizers. Rule number 3 is maximizers work best as they're stacked and not pushing too hard on each one. And the first thing I would say is, when you're working with maximizers or any mastering stage, try and get some sort of analyzer up so you can see what's going on. Blue Cat Audio do a frequency analyzer that's free. I don't know if it has loudness with it. The Cubase mix console does come with a loudness meter nowadays. There are bound to be some free ones online you can download if you need to. With this particular Waves one, you can choose between peak or RMS. RMS, as I say, was the old standard, and that's the one I stick to. I would suggest you stick with that. Peak is irrelevant, really. It would tell you when you're clipping it. It will go up to -0.1, but you know that that's the case because you're going to be using limiters to allow that to happen, so that's not too relevant for you. RMS is an average loudness, and that's what you're interested in. One point, actually, because it's average, if you've got a song that has lots of, say, an acoustic verse and then a heavy chorus, your RMS is naturally going to be lower than one that's heavy all the way through. So don't try and push ones that have a lot of dynamic variation as hard as a song that is heavy all the way through, because you just won't reach that. So don't spoil the sound by trying. You'll only manage 1 to 2 dB lower, I think, on average. And that works for string or classical if you're doing any sort of intros that are big sort of orchestral pieces. They need that dynamic range as well, and they won't sound good if you're pushing them as high as you are with your heavy mixes. So with this in place here, another free maximizer that's great, the George Young W1 limiter. This is a clone of the Waves L1. Very clean, and up to about 3 dBs of gain it works really well. As I say, you don't particularly need the release, but it's always good to tick adaptive release if you've got the option, because it does try and read the beat and work with it, so that works well. The ceiling, because it's a limiter, we want that at least on -1. I would suggest -2, because I have noticed, this being a free VST, it does clip over that sometimes to -1, so and when it's at -0.1, sorry, it will clip over to 0 sometimes, so keep that down at -0.2. Let's have a listen to this mix, and as I say, I'll pull it up to maybe 3 dB. Pay attention down here as well, this RMS figure in the middle that's currently on -40. You'll see how this is affected by the addition of the maximizer. We should get an extra 1 or 2 dB gain out of this without making the audio sound any worse at all. Okay, that's actually a really good result. 3 dB of gain there. It seems to have added about 2.2 down here on the RMS, which perfectly happy with because it's very transparent. And again, another free one, Google George Young's W1 limiter. You'll find that online. Really transparent, really good one to use. Moving on from there, I would go into Ozone 5.